Good afternoon, everyone. It is a pleasure to have you here today with us. My name is Andra Gillespie, and on behalf of the staff and the visiting fellows of the James Weldon Johnson Institute, I'd like to welcome you to today's Race and Colloquium series, colloquium discussion. Today, we are pleased to have Professor Monique Moultrie from Georgia State. Dr. Moultrie is an associate professor of religious studies at Georgia State University. She recently finished up a visiting associate professor position in the departments of women's studies and African American religion at the Harvard Divinity School. She earned degrees from Vanderbilt University, Harvard Divinity School, and Duke University. Her scholarly pursuits include projects in sexual ethics, African American religions, and gender and sexuality studies. Her book, which she'll be talking about in part today, but also a new project, is called Passionate and Pious: Religious Media and Black Women's Sexuality. It was published by Duke University Press and was the 2018 Book of the Year for the Religious Communication Association. Dr. Moultrie has published extensively in journals and edited volumes, and her forthcoming research is a study of Black lesbian religious leadership and faith activism. Her research has been supported by Harvard Divinity School's Women's Studies and Religion Fellowship, a Ford Foundation postdoctoral fellowship, the Wabash Center for Teaching and Learning Grants, and a GSU Dean's Early Career Award, as well as an American Academy of Religion Individual Research Grant. Outside of the university, Dr. Moultrie was consultant for the National Institutes of Health and the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender Religious Archives Network. She is a content development working group member for Columbia University's Center on African American Religion, Sexual Politics, and Social Justice, and the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choices Scholars Group, a group of religious scholars collaborating at the intersection of religion and reproductive justice. Within the larger American Academy of Religion Guild, Dr. Moultrie is the former Status of Women in the Profession Chair and a former co-chair of the Religion and Sexuality Unit. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Moultrie.
I want to thank the directors of the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the study of race and difference, for the warm invitation and the opportunity to discuss my research with you. When I got the initial invitation, I inquired whether I should be focused on my published book or my upcoming work, and I was asked if I could intertwine the two. Thus, I'm going to offer some initial insights from my book-length study of heterosexual Black women's sexual agency, and then segue into my chapter 4 of the book, which focuses on same-gender sexual agency as a way of talking about the project I just finished while on research leave at Harvard. And I am trained as a womanist, which is a Black feminist whose research bridges religious studies, cultural studies, women's studies, and sexuality studies. At its core, my work has centered on addressing the moral crises facing Black women as they make choices about their sexuality in societies that often negate their ability to choose. My first monograph that's here on this slide, that's the cover, began with my interest in prophetess Juanita Bynum, a televangelist perhaps familiar to those of you in Atlanta, or maybe familiar from her notable sermon-termed video, No More Sheets. As a college-age student, I was fascinated by her revealing tale of sexual anguish and desire that fueled my exploration of other faith-based sexuality ministries that provided messages to Black women about faith and sexuality. My book, Passionate and Pious: Religious Media and Black Women's Sexuality, tracks Protestant Christian ministries that were made for heterosexual Black women by other heterosexual Black women. And namely in the text, I pick up a discussion on Wives in Waiting, which is a group out of Texas, the Pinky Promise Movement, which is centered in Atlanta, Michelle McKinney-Hammond's Heart Wing Ministries, and the Soulmate documentary. This religious media typically occurs outside of traditional Black church settings. And these faith-based sexuality ministries, which for our purposes are books, classes, singles ministries, conferences, television programming, internet dating, podcasts, etc. These were important sites for decoding conservative sexual rhetoric and investigating female sexual agency. I conducted virtual and in-person ethnographic research with 30 Black women aged 18 to 81 in Nashville, Tennessee, Atlanta, Georgia, Chatham, Virginia, which is where I'm from, and Boston, Massachusetts. as I was interested in studying how everyday Black women received messages about sexuality from these religious leaders. Part 1 of the book explores the demand for faith-based sexuality ministries because faith-based sexuality leaders are in constant communication via text, email, journal, meditations, and even messages through social media like Instagram and Facebook. Through close readings of these messages and focus group interviews with the participants, I explored what it meant for Black women to seek out celibacy movements, whose leaders' message of sexual frustration and angst spoke to more than just marginalized Christian singles. I spent 3 years in the virtual field of the Pinky Promise and the Wives in Waiting celibacy groups, while also attending their local and national meetings, so I could hear firsthand from those attending how they viewed abstinence as an act of self-determination. The second half of the book presents several agential situations, namely same-sex desire, senior sexual expression, and sexual pleasure. I was curious if religious media was relevant for women over the age of 50, if it targeted women for whom marriage may no longer be the goal. I was particularly interested in interpreting the numerous messages about sexual pleasure found within these ministries. My subjects were not bashful in talking about sexual taboos, which should not be shocking. Yet my text is one of the first to include accounts from Black Christian women about these topics. Rather than just critiquing faith-based sexuality ministries from Black Christian women, rather than just critiquing faith-based sexuality ministries without offering anything constructive in return, I wanted to highlight sexual pleasure as a site of Black women's sexual agency. I dare to talk about sexual pleasure, being consciously aware that my subject position as a Black woman talking about sexuality can reinforce stereotypes of Black women as licentious, as sex-obsessed, or whatever the stereotype might be. I imagine that there might be fertile space for Black women to address their sexuality and to discuss more than a history of sexual pain and shame. To unearth these not so silent truths, I inquired about sexual desires, fetishes, things that made her toes curl and allowed her to moan her own name. Masturbation was a topic of concern because women at different ages and relationship statuses wondered if it was permissible within Christianity. One participant asked almost indignantly, "Well, does the Bible say anything about sex toys?" And a lively conversation ensued, with some members expressing, "Oh no, that this was putting a toy in the place of the husband that God was going to provide." And some feeling that it was perfectly normal and probably not a concern of the Lord because they didn't see any explicit reference or reason in the Bible why they could not seek solo sexual gratification. While national sex surveys report that 28% of Black women reported partnered masturbation, most of our conversations when I did my focus groups discussed masturbation as a solitary act. When I posed the question of whether they participated in self-pleasuring with their significant others, perhaps in a way of showing their partners what was sexually pleasing to them, many laughed, but none responded. And I was left wondering if admitting the need for sexual pleasure outside of one's partner was really the transgressive act, not the particular example of masturbation. My research posits that radical sexual honesty and responsibility are the cornerstones for healthy Black female sexuality. I agree with Patricia Hill Collins' text, Black Sexual Politics, that we should develop honest bodies where Black people reject prevalent ideas and stereotypes about gender and sexuality in favor of integrating their mind, soul, and body. Using literary author Alice Walker's theory of womanism to posit that scholarship should be grounded in the lived realities of women of color, my study on agency highlights how Black women were reconfiguring heteronormativity to fit their unique circumstances. While the majority of my research, as I noted in the book, focuses on Black heterosexuality, the rest of this talk is going to actually focus on same-sex desire. This interest was explored in chapter 4 of my book, where the participants admitted to same-sex desire, but were actively seeking through their faith to overcome this same-sex attraction. evangelist. So she's an electronic evangelist whose ministries mostly happen on the web. Ty Adams, her ministry is discussed in this chapter, and she shares a really sexually graphic story that is focused on the pleasures of lesbian sex. It seemed like she was having the best sex of her life, and yet she felt that she must overcome that same-sex attraction because she did not feel that that was God's will. The chapter asserts a form of relationality that is not constricted to monogamy, but instead highlights respect, consent, and mutuality as the benchmarks, not relationship, marriage, or even orgasm. This is described in this chapter as womanist sexual hospitality, which accepts a full range of sexual expression and identities as an alternative to passing as heterosexual and Black religious communities. Overall, the book was an exploration of the anomalies that I had not expected. Things like church women admitting to same-sex desire, yet actively participating in heterosexual faith-based celibacy movements, or senior women who actively confess seeking out sexual partners, or Christian women expressing a willingness to seek sexual relationship outside of marriage, or even outside of a monogamous relationship. While those women participating in heterosexual celibacy movements shocked me, I was equally taken aback when I began interviewing Black lesbian religious leaders who were proudly asserting being Christian lesbian religious leaders. While my first book has investigated how Black women asserted agency in sexual domains, the second book focuses on how sexual and religious actors exert agency in religious spheres. The second project, currently titled Hidden Histories, Faith and Black Lesbian Leadership, it examines the oral histories of 18 cisgender Black lesbian religious leaders, namely women who are at the forefront of societal change within their religious spaces. Most of my interviewees were Protestant Christian, as represented here on the slide. They were ages 37 to 72, although I did diversify the study by conducting additional interviews with two persons who were spiritualists, a Jewish rabbi, and a Buddhist lay leader. For our time today, I'm going to focus mostly on Protestant Christian experiences as I demonstrate these religious leaders' connection to traditional Black church religiosity. My overall project emphasizes the significance of self-identity and social location as activism, because self-naming for these women is an important tool of resistance and liberation. I began by identifying them as Black with full acknowledgement of the problems associated with treating Blackness as some ontological term, supposedly referencing something innate and present for all community members. When discussing Black lesbians and religion, notions of the historic Black church require some unpacking. Black Protestantism, or the Black church, is widely understood to include the 7 Black Protestant denominations that are shown here on the slide. Here we have the National Baptist Convention, the National Baptist Convention of America, the Progressive National Convention, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church, the Christian Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Church of God in Christ. These are the traditions that the majority of my interviewees were reared in, and thus they are important and significant for a focus on what their stances were on same-sex desire, because the majority of the interviewees left these traditions to go to Christian denominations that were more welcoming. Despite this slide's clear depiction of Black Protestant denominations as openly antagonistic to Black LGBT persons, such as was seen during the 2015 passing of same-sex marriage, when all 7 of the historically Black denominations publicized statements denouncing same-sex marriage. So these were statements here on the slide that were, you had to hunt for them within the church doctrine, within the rules of conduct, within each of the traditions. But in 2015, all of these denominations publicized statements denouncing same-sex marriage. Yet, this talk is only going to tangentially address homophobia. Yes, the Black church is homophobic. it's just as homophobic as the rest of secular society is. And largely, I think this homophobia is because it tends to rely on conservative biblical interpretation as its foundation. Yes, the Black church is homophobic because diverse sexualities have historically been deemed a threat to Black respectability in racist societies. Yes, when Black people discriminate against their own LGBT community members on the basis of religious belief, this conflicts with the cultural expectation of Black churches' historical memory as justice-seeking communities. The reality is Black churches are spaces of complicated acceptance for many LGBT persons. And this is damaging for the full thriving of Black LGBT congregants who are typically trapped in a space of negotiated acceptance, where their gifts and talents are publicly appreciated, while they are encouraged to only be privately authentic to their lives and loves. Ultimately, my project asserts that the active presence of Black lesbians in religious spaces is not an outlier, but rather elucidates the ways in which Black women's religious leadership is often ignored and the complexities of their lives diminished. This taught me the significance of these leaders standing in their truth and advocating for others to do the same. I contend that their bold choice to publicly be out as queer religious leaders is their form of resistance to the many forms of discrimination that they faced. For example, pastoral theologian Horace Griffin has up these 4 types of invisibility experienced by lesbian Christians that I'm going to outline. Griffin says that guilty passing is the experience where lesbians feel that they are sinful and deserving of the rage imposed by heterosexual church members. Angry passing is where lesbians publicly deny or remain silent about their own sexuality while expressing rage and condemnation for other gays and lesbians. So they're actively seeking out to punish other gay and lesbian persons who are out. Silent passing is where lesbians publicly deny or remain silent about their sexual attraction and are not active in their religious traditions for fear that they'd be outed. And finally, opportunistic passing, he describes as a scenario where lesbians have accepted themselves, but feel that they cannot come out or speak out against homophobia within religious spaces. Rejecting these models of passing and choosing to live freely is a private decision with public consequences. These Black women religious activists are examples of persons who resist, subvert, and redefine Black faith and culture because the freedom to be is courageous when structures seem to demand one's invisibility or erasure. I interpret their lives through an activism lens, highlighting here on the screen sociologist Patricia Hill Collins' notion of everyday activism, which she defines as the private decisions to reject external definitions of Afro-American womanhood and Black women's everyday behavior as a form of activism, because Black people who view themselves as fully human, as subjects, they become activists no matter how limited the sphere of their activism, end quote. It is in these private decisions made public that these Black lesbian religious leaders' lives become theory, a theoretical positioning taken from Morego and Azundua's theorizing that contains a politics of resistance and demonstrates their own leadership. Just as women are currently at the forefront of the Black Lives Matter movement, so too, every path towards Black liberation has depended on the expertise and labor of Black women. Yet these contemporary queer leaders' activism has often not been told as part of the long liberating work, which has led to the necessity of queering religious histories. Princeton University doctoral candidate Ahmad Green Hayes suggests that this task requires reimagining religion as more than a solely heterosexist and heterosexual category, by taking seriously how queer people across genders and sexualities have participated in African American religions, and in my case, social justice activism. This calls for a more expansive historiography that brings in the lesbian identity of women like Rebecca Cox Jackson, or Dr. Mary Evans, or Sister Rosetta Tharpe, or even Pauline Murray. These women's lives and loves are part of a long arc of women working towards justice in the world, and it's their legacy that my interviewees join. When I first started this project, my goal was to secure these women's legacies in our her stories, acknowledging that Black queer women's leadership is a largely underdeveloped area. In the last 20 years, there's been scholarship on Black LGBT identity that focuses on religion, and even some recent work that focuses specifically on Black lesbians. Many of these works are created by gay male authors whose works discern that religion does not hold as significant a role for Black lesbian women as it does for Black gay men. Performance scholar and oral historian E. Patrick Johnson's text, Black, Queer, Southern Women, reports his surprise that the women that he interviewed did not enjoy church or find it to be a refuge, as many of his gay Black male interviewees had experienced. Similar to Griffin's assumptions about Black women passing in churches, Johnson's text expressed women's disavowal of Black churches, seeking instead women-centered alternative spiritualities. My interviewees and their communities contradict such studies by demonstrating Black lesbian religious leaders who purposely work within religious spaces and who find in Black churches joy and space to flourish. Their Black lesbian identity is instrumental to understanding the magnitude of oppressions that they have overcome to break the stained glass ceiling within their religious spaces. Contrary to prior scholarship's claims, my interviewees found solace in religion and were invested in utilizing their racial, sexual, gender, and religious identities in their activism. In each of these interviews, I found that their stories of resistance and rise to leadership was dependent upon each woman making peace with the various strands of herself. When Audre Lorde writes about the difficulties of being an open lesbian in the Black community, she's speaking of the realities that some are deemed in conflict, some identities are deemed in conflict with others. For example, loyalty to the Black community has presumed fidelity and perhaps even submission to Black men. Thus, activism that does not privilege maleness can cause interracial trauma. As women who are motivated by deeply religious ideologies, this is often deemed antithetical to their queer identity, as some see religion as solely a source of harm for the LGBT community. As female leaders who are not following heteronormative leadership, that structures that allow for women in leadership as companions to males, they are challenged by those who deem women, and especially queer women, unworthy of religious calling. Thus, my interest in women who claim their authentic voice to speak from their particular identities is also a reflection of my interest in Black women's self-determination and agency. In the last half of the talk, I want to take up this interest in authenticity and authority and theorize from the lives of 4 Black lesbian religious leaders. You will hear from Reverend Dr. Deborah Johnson, Elder Darlene Garner, Reverend Naomi Washington Leapheart, and Reverend Kentina Washington Leapheart. I'm going to offer some introductory biographies for each of these women and then incorporate their own words to my discussion of how important authenticity and agency is to womanist ethical leadership. So first up, we have Reverend Deborah Johnson, who's the founder and president of Inner Light Ministries, an omni-faith outreach ministry dedicated to teaching the practical applications of the universal spiritual principles. She is also the founder and president of the Motivational Institute, an organizational development consulting firm which specializes in cultural diversity. In addition to being an author and an instructor, she is also a founding member of the Agape International Spiritual Center in Los Angeles with Michael Beckwith, and serves on the leadership council of the Association of Global New Thought. She was a successful co-litigant in 2 landmark civil rights cases in California, including one that set precedent in the state civil rights bill and the other that defeated the challenge to legalizing domestic partnerships. I conducted my interview with Reverend Deborah in October of 2017. More so than my other interviewees, Reverend Deborah included in her narrative clear historical markers, perhaps because of our presumed age difference, or perhaps to remind future generations mining her oral history for information. She wanted to remind me and them of the long arc of social justice that made possible her being her own authentic self. Despite there being nothing overt in her Pentecostal upbringing, paving the way for her to be free, out, and fully recognized in the world. She described her long-held belief that there could be, and I'm quoting her, a marriage between the idea of being able to just be okay, be accepted, respectable, and not second-class citizen or second tier. And if I had to make the environments myself, so be it, end quote. Reverend Deborah had been out at an early age, having the same girlfriend from the 10th grade through the end of her college years. But she recalled being strictly punished for her boldness by her parents, who forced her to undergo shock therapy and threatened to cut her off financially if she was publicly a lesbian. The vignette that you have here on your screen is her realization that resistance started with telling the truth, even when it had dire consequences. And so I'm going to read it in case it's smaller on the screen for you. She says, so it's this triple whammy. I have the law saying I'm a criminal, the church saying I'm satanic, and the psychiatric association saying I'm sick. So I really felt like I didn't have any other choice. It was like fight or die. So my activism was really about saying, you're wrong. All of you are wrong. I don't know how I knew, but I just knew. And in my mind, I could see a day. It was almost like the slaves that could see freedom. I mean, I could literally see a day when it would be okay to be open. I could be proud. I really could be in a relationship. The world would accept me. I wouldn't be a second-class citizen. It was so real to me that I was willing to fight for that. So for me, it was kind of a peeling away at it. My theology had to change. But first, I had to literally, in my mind, be willing to go to hell for my authenticity. And that was the conclusion that I came to around 14 or 15, that if there was a hell, that I was just going to have to go. Because if I lived the life they wanted me to live, I'd have been in hell here and still had gone to hell because I knew who I was. End quote. From this difficult act of resisting her parents and their expectations, she went on to find solace in the religious science community, where she felt free to be her complete self and have that self be embraced. Yet Reverend Deborah was quick to note that despite being in a racially and religiously mixed environment that is good on racial diversity and LGBT issues, the challenge for her claiming her agency in that space was, and I'm quoting her, in assisting new members in adjusting to the more inclusive environment. Most lack skills in interacting with such levels of diversity, especially with lesbians of color in positions of authority, end quote. It is because Reverend Deborah had learned to accept her full self. She taught others to authentically merge several of their unique identity categories. While most of the interviewees told of periods of their lives when they felt forced to lead a compartmentalized life in which some identities could not be expressed, eventually all came to the same conclusion as Reverend Deborah, that bifurcation was not the path to authenticity. Thus, the radical pronouncement that queer and religious-led female leadership can go hand in hand demonstrated that Black lesbians are not invisible, but invaluable members of religious organizations. For example, most of the women I interviewed were in leadership in predominantly white settings. Though they experienced discrimination as deeply intersectional, they acknowledged that in these settings, they were often viewed by their race first. Those leading in predominantly Black spaces faced obstacles primarily based on their gender. A few noted that they were either expected to de-emphasize their gender or their lesbian identity. Among those working for queer organizations, some commented on feeling the need to downplay their religious leadership or finding themselves in religious institutions where either their queerness or their femaleness presented challenges to how their authority was received and perceived. As one interviewee noted, these challenges resulted in a deep compartmentalization that left her unwoven, with her strands coming apart. This second case illustrates this compartmentalization. It concerns Elder Darlene Garner, a longtime leader in the Universal Fellowship of Metropolitan Community Churches, or MCC for short, the first Christian denomination to serve the spiritual needs of the lesbian, gay, and transgendered community. She served as a pastor of several MCC churches and founded the MCC Conference for People of African Descent, Our Friends and Allies, in 1997. After decades of leadership, Elder Garner retired from ordained ministry in the MCC in 2018 at the age of 69. Her interview highlighted both the damage she experienced from compartmentalization and the fulfillment she left from living a whole life. Elder Garner was my very first interview, conducted for the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, Transgender, Queer Religious Archives Network, or LGBTran. And I conducted this first interview in 2010. So I've been doing interviews for about a decade. In this interview and in follow-up conversations, Elder Garner emphasized the process of coming out as a coming into self-awareness. She recounted a feeling of coming home when she arrived at the Metropolitan Community Church, Washington. And she was an active member there from 1976 until her publicly forced retirement in 2018. It was in this religious space that she grew in leadership, but also in her awareness that she needed a more integrated life. I'm going to read the quote here on the slide. She says, "I was a member of MCC of Washington, D.C., and with my 3 children, had a really busy time as a member of the church, just kind of immersed myself in new theological discoveries and learned how to fully embrace myself as a beloved child of God, with no need for shame for being a lesbian. It was a wonderful time of self-discovery and discovering new things about God. But one of the realities that I faced at the time was that as a Black woman, I felt that as I had to choose between being Black and being lesbian. And so when I look back on that particular time in my life, I say I became unwoven. My strands all came apart. So there came a point where my social community shifted from being with my lesbian social community through MCC to working with 6 others to found an organization called the National Coalition of Black Lesbians and Gays in 1978. And I decided that I would never again allow anything to cause me to leave any part or piece of myself, that I would engage all of it. I would enter life from a place of wholeness, not a place of brokenness. And no one would ever come between me and myself, my whole self. And that's kind of the way I've lived since then," end quote. As she grew in ministry, she felt her calling to MCC community instead of the predominantly Black Unity Fellowship movement was a result of her desire to lead a life of integrity and to do so in a community of diversity, one that she felt was and I'm quoting her, "manifestation of heaven on earth," end quote. She credited MCC for making space for her to be all who she is, wherever she is, knowing that that gives hope to someone else. Yet as the highest ranking African-American in the denomination, she recognized that being the first spiritual leader of African descent in MCC meant a responsibility to make sure she was not the last leader. After 4 decades of leadership within MCC, she was passed over as the denomination's next moderator, rumored to have been ousted for calling out MCC for wavering on its commitments to diversity. This painful example of authenticity is particularly striking because for her and others, living authentically had cost them tremendously. While what I had not expected, I had expected the tremendous cost. I had not expected the benefits, and particularly the joy that they would find through helping others advocate for their own authenticity. This was especially the case for my youngest interviewees. I specifically wanted to interview younger Black lesbian religious leaders because I felt that they were displaying a different sense of hope and perhaps even a different sense of authenticity. I surmised that this might be because their generation had had more opportunities to freely express their identities than others. My final 2 oral histories are of a couple, both faith leaders who placed a premium on living authentically so that they could amplify others' voices and urge them to live holistic lives. Here we have Reverend Naomi Washington Leapheart, who's currently the Director of Faith-Based and Interfaith Affairs for the City of Philadelphia, and was formerly the Faith Work Director for the National LGBTQ Task Force, the country's oldest national LGBT justice and equality group. She served as a co-pastor of St. Peter's United Church of Christ in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, where she was the only openly queer licensed minister and African-American at the church. She was ordained by the Fellowship of Affirming Ministries and the United Church of Christ, and is an adjunct faculty member in the Theology and Religious Studies Department at Villanova University. I interviewed Reverend Naomi in 2019, and she was my youngest interviewee at 37 years old. She spoke of answering her call to ministry as an act of authenticity and an ethic of doing no harm. When I asked her about coming out while at seminary, she responded in a way that signaled that her decision was more than just her living her own truth. While in seminary, she recognized that she had to live fully in order to advocate for others to do the same. Bolstered by mentors like interviewee Bishop Reverend Dr. Yvette Flunder, who told her that she could tell the truth and survive, she connected this understanding to public ministry for social justice organizing. She had grown weary of grassroots organizing where she was only able to advocate for some parts of her identity, acknowledging that I sort of became a little disillusioned about the extent to which I was going to be able to be authentic and I'll actually fight for the people who need justice, all the people who need justice in this role, end quote. When she transitioned to working for the task force and eventually the city of Philadelphia, she was able to leverage all of her identities to work on behalf of others. While acknowledging that her Blackness was a primary identity, this does not reflect a fragmented self. On the contrary, she insists, and I'm quoting her, "I think my queerness and my womanness sort of work together. What does it mean? I, as a Black woman who loves another Black woman, I think there's something that really shapes my sense of self. A Black woman who loves another Black woman who's raising a Black girl. We're always talking to them about what it means to be womanish, to love deeply and fully and unapologetically, to let your yes be yes and no be no. That deeply shapes me," end quote. This communal understanding of personal identity reflects philosopher Charles Taylor's theorizing on the ethics of authenticity. In Taylor's oft-cited definition, he determines that authenticity is self-definition in dialogue, as he rejects self-determining freedom as individualistic and even selfish. In Taylor's understanding, our authentic selves are formed in community, and our moral salvation comes from recovering authentic moral contact with ourselves. Both notions of authenticity are held simultaneously, and this is represented in Reverend Naomi's query of how she could advocate for others when she was not ready to advocate publicly for herself. Not surprisingly, her wife shared a similar realization. Reverend Kentina Washington Leapheart was the former director of programs for reproductive justice and sexuality educator at the Religious Institute. She began her ministerial career as a chaplain in both healthcare and clinical care settings. She identifies as a queer womanist follower of many paths, including the way of Jesus, and volunteers her time in the greater Philadelphian community organizations that work on maternal and child health and faith. Jointly ordained and married with a teenage daughter, she and her wife, Reverend Naomi's callings complement each other as they work side by side, though in different spheres of ministry. Reverend Kentina placed a high value on authenticity and even delayed her ministerial ordination in search of what she called a more excellent and authentic way. This path forward would not require her to mute any parts of herself to fit in. And at her ordination, she noted that in the fellowship of affirming ministries, and I'm quoting her, "All of me is welcome here. All of my queer self, my Black self, my woman self, my charismatic spirit-filled self, my contemplative self, my multi-faith sensibility self, my intellectual scholarly self, my questioning doubting self, my faithful sure self," end quote. The comfort in having all of her identities accepted at her ordination also shows up in her ministerial and professional commitments. In her role as a chaplain for Presbyterian homes, she was not out at work. As her pastoral team's only Black person and with only one queer staff member, she did not feel sufficiently comfortable there to be out. The need to be fully herself became more pressing. She needed to feel that she could bring all of her into whatever space she occupied. In her oral history interview, when I asked her if she could signal which identities were more important to her, she talked about what identities she needed to be her own best self. She said, "I think I realized in the last several years that so many of my identities have shifted and changed, and some have even been projected on to me that weren't mine. I got married and I'm married to someone who's very public facing, and I wasn't so much right before that. And so I've learned what that means and that identity shift. And so I've been doing a lot of work around who am I as I shift and change. So right now, I think I am my best thing. So that's an identity. I'm a mother of a Black girl, teenager, which is a particular identity. I'm a wife. I'm a minister who is between calls, end quote. Part of what she recognized as living faithfully was also her uniting her work with her work for justice in the world. She uses her privileges, her experiences to be a social justice leader. Yet she shared with me the need for boundaries from the potentially all-consuming social justice world, which shows an awareness of how she wants to live and show her faith. Maintaining boundaries by advocating first for herself is how she is able to show up in movement spaces and advocate for others. I highlight her as a final source of authenticity because so many of my interviewees experienced burnout, which stymied their longevity in activist work. In conclusion, all of these women are examples of womanist psychology, Dr. Layli Maparyan's theory of standing in. Maparyan identifies standing in as staying within an oppressive system in order to change it from the inside. This womanist method, she says, defies a fractionating tendency by staying inside despite the difficult and personal risks to oneself. Only by being authentic to their own needs were they able to serve in any capacity those that they led. This push towards authenticity is important in expanding current depictions of ethical leadership. I contend that my interviewees represent a womanist leadership style that is shaped by their intersectional identities. Building on the various theories of womanism, such as Black feminism, being concerned with Black women's culture and faith, and maintaining a communal anti-oppression orientation, their womanist leadership styles can teach others values like agency, liberation, wholeness, justice, and reciprocity. In sum, when I looked at their stories, I had gathered the themes of resistance through social justice activism, spirituality, authenticity, and cooperative leadership came to the forefront. I discovered that their lesbian identification often triggered a cooperative and holistic justice style of leading that was instructive for other leaders. The project that I've just finished working on offers a womanist ethical leadership model based on these women's lives, patterned after their stories, that emphasizes leadership strategies that are non-hierarchical, which means they're not reliant on just one solitary leader. They're para-institutional, which means they involve more than just the religious community. And they're intergenerational, which allows them to include leadership from persons of varying ages. These leadership styles allow for leaders at any age or stage of life. Ultimately, they're examples of shared leadership structures, coalition building, and social justice activism are lessons for religious and secular leaders. My research this past year has been my attempt to respond to a question I received from Angelina Yaboa, an African exchange student, who asked me several years ago, what had US womanists built that lasts? She had given me the example of African feminists who had built dormitories for female students in an institution that had not previously housed female students. When I answered this student initially, I spoke about the US womanist narrative of documenting narratives of survival. But after spending this year going through these interviews, I realized that the Black lesbian religious leaders that I interviewed were also architects of building a new way of being, a way of being in the world, just like Patricia Hill Collins expressed. Yes, they have built institutions, but their everyday actions of being themselves means that they have also built a legacy of authenticity, resistance, and flourishing that I'm proud to share with you all today. So if you're interested in the stories that I've shared and you want to read more or hear more, all of the interviews that I have done are either up on this website. This is the LGBTQ RAN website. They're up here, and you can find their bio sketches and the full transcript and the audios of the interviews if you'd like to delve deeper. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Moultrie. That was a fascinating and excellent presentation. I just want to remind all of our viewers that if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the Q&A section, which is at the bottom of your screen. I do have a couple of questions from our fellows, and so I'm going to start with those first. So the first question is from Dr. Barbara Combs. And she says, first, I want to say how really powerful Reverend Deborah Johnson's comments were. Thank you for sharing them. You talked about a status you called negotiated acceptance, where the gifts, talents, and abilities of Black lesbians in the Black church are welcomed, even if they personally are not. She wondered if there was any discussion or feeling that Black gay men, especially those whose gift might be very public, like being the choir director or a singer, were treated differently than the women.
Great question. So when I first started this project, I was really surprised that there was this like seeming absence, because I said there's not a lot of scholarship, but the scholarship that's out there is written by gay men. And so they write quite a bit about the gay male experience and how they are housed in stereotypical positions like choir director, minister of music, and that they're fully celebrated in those gifts, that if they can sing, they are given the keys to the kingdom. And that there wasn't a parallel for Black women, that there wasn't this sense that there was an area where Black women's gifts were celebrated and they were allowed to thrive. And this just made no sense to me. It didn't make sense to me on a practical level, because churches are full of Black women. Like, numerically speaking, they're full of Black women. And yet the hierarchical structures do elevate men. So any man that does anything will get 9 times more shine than a woman will on any given day. And that's real. And that has nothing to do, I think, with heteronormativity. That's just patriarchy, multifaceted patriarchy, but patriarchy. So yes, I do think that there is a difference, but I think the difference is in an inability to see the gifts that women bring. That women are often talked about as the backbone of Black churches, but that's where they're supposed to stay, in the back. Their gifts aren't supposed to be at the forefront. So because men are so absent, any man that you see, we've got to pile on the praise to get more men to want to do that work. Black women are going to come regardless. So they're taken for granted. So I do think they're treated differently because Black women don't get celebrated at all in any capacity, whether they're heterosexual or same gender loving. It's very rare for that to be the case. And yet, when I looked at the specific examples of these Black lesbian religious leaders, their churches, and this is true across the board for same gender church-led churches. Richard Pitt, sociologist Richard Pitt, he's working on a project on church foundings and queer leaders. And both of us see the same thing, that churches tend to follow the gender of their leader. So if it's a gay-led church, a gay man-led church, there'll be more Black gay men in the church. If it's a Black lesbian-led church, there'll be more lesbians in the church. And in those examples, I think women are highlighted and they are treated special and they are celebrated. But I think, again, that has to do with the leadership style. So the women that are there are particularly appreciated, and thus their gifts and their talents are really encouraged. But it's a great point, because I do think that overall there is a difference. But I think sadly that difference is based on patriarchy more than anything else.
Thank you very much for that question. The next question is from Dr. Francine Allen. And she writes, traditionally, the Black church in all its varieties has been thought of as helping the Black community achieve agency in the larger American society, promoting educational advancement, championing voting rights, providing missionary services. Yet Black women have not felt empowered by the Black church. Can you talk a bit more about how Black women have practiced standing in, specifically to stay within and connected to the Black church while feeling disempowered?
Yeah. So why don't we leave? Yeah, that's that is the question upon questions. So I'll answer personally, and then I'll answer what my research has shown. So personally, I think that Black women, heterosexual and same gender loving women, have stayed in these spaces despite feeling disempowered because there haven't been other alternatives. that it's a cruel world that provides very little solace, very little comfort to Black women. And so that's one of the reasons why when I did the study on these celibacy movements, I wasn't hypercritical, because I really don't think that there's a lot of alternatives out there for women. I think these celibacy movements are damaging in some particular ways, but I also think they do some things well. They do some things that sororities and organizations aren't providing, in terms of accountability, in terms of support networks, in terms of the ability to show love for women who are feeling unloved by national standards, by personal standards, family, familial standards. And so I think we stay in these spaces because where else do we go? And for those, I think, who are joining and starting their own organizations, or who are creating something different, I think they do that because, sort of like Deborah Johnson's point, if they living in hell, they might as well have the best version that they can have. So they're willing to try something that might not work, because what they have, they know doesn't work. And I think that was shown in more of the examples that I had. I was actually surprised that when I first started doing the research, when I first interviewed men, I started this project, as I mentioned, in 2010. And when I started the project, the men that I interviewed were all leaders in Black denominations. So they founded organizations, and they were, big about creating the next generation of leaders, and largely male leaders. And women weren't. And I was baffled by that. Like, why aren't women joining into these organizations? Why are they still working in white folk groups? And largely, they couldn't deal with the patriarchy in the Black male spaces anymore. That they recognized the gifts and talents that they had, and the leadership skills that they had, and they just weren't willing to push themselves down and be small anymore. And they were thriving in white denominations, despite white denominations' racism. And so for me, that was telling, that we maybe are getting to a place where we're not going to stand in, and we're not going to just bide our time and stay because there's no other place, that we're willing to go out and find other places. And those places may not look like the places that nurtured us when we were in our youth. They may be totally different spaces. So many of them are like creating. Two of the women that I interviewed were Unity, which is the Black gay denomination. It's kind of the parallel to MCC. And they were Unity. One was a Unity bishop, and she left Unity, and she's now United Church of Christ. She has a predominantly Black United Church of Christ church. And so there are ways in which I think you can keep putting your head against the same wall before you decide, hey, maybe there's a softer wall out there somewhere else. And I think we're seeing more of that happen. But still, overwhelmingly, the statistics that have been put out by the Pew Research and other data sites are showing that same gender loving persons participate more actively in faith traditions than any other grouping. So white gays, because of the persecutions that they feel, they just leave their churches, they leave their religious institutions, and they don't come back. If they come back to something totally different. They are the spiritual but not religious groups. And that isn't the case, that Black gays are persecuted. Black queer people are maligned in their spaces, and yet that's also where they feel the most at home. And I don't know if that's a just toxic relationship they can't break, or if there's a sense of everything else they get supersedes the punishment that they receive. And I think that's some tension that we're going to see as younger generations come out, because I think they're going to force churches, if we're talking about the Black spaces, to be attentive in the same way that these celibacy movements force churches to have to deal with singles and the single experience.
Thank you. This question is from my colleague, Dr. Beretta Smith-Shamade from Film and Media Studies. She says, thank you for your scholarship and insights. Can you speak to how ideas around sexuality are currently circulating in traditional Black churches and in non-traditional churches?
Great, large question. So yeah, the Black church has never been silent on sexuality. And I think that that's an important starting point, that as ill-equipped as it has been to respond to the needs of its members, it has never just said nothing. The same churches that would tell me as a young girl. So I start the book with an experience when I was 16 of watching the granddaughter of the pastor of my church be brought before the church because she gotten pregnant. And she has to beg the church's forgiveness. And I was just utterly confused. As a 16-year-old child, I just did not understand what I was witnessing, because I knew deacons who had children outside of their primary marriage. Like, as a child, I knew this. This was public gossip. I knew people who were unfaithful in their relationships. That was public knowledge. And yet none of these people had to come before the church. They all still had their religious standing and were still, they were buried well. Like, nobody talked about the side children and the side family at the funeral line. And yet this girl was forced to come forward. And in a way, it reminded me of all the times where I was a gifted young girl, and I was a public speaker, and I would go to church events and they would have me do events. And someone would always talk about the length of my skirt, but no one talked about the deacons or the, trustee whose hand was on my thigh. Like, that was baffling to me, that we would have one set of conversations, but not have others, that we were constantly constraining Black female sexuality without any care to do anything to say anything other than boys will be boys and men will be men. So first, that's my first gut response, is that churches talk a lot, particularly traditional Black churches talk a lot about sexuality. Do they do so healthily? No. And I think that these celibacy movements are $1 billion industries. And so I don't think that churches began to be responsive to the needs of singles because of the goodness of their hearts. They saw, hey, TD Jakes has got a conference, is bringing 100,000 people to Atlanta. Well, shoot, we could probably get 5,000 to our church out in Augusta if we did the same thing. That they began to see the money behind it. And that was a driving factor. I also think that the talks about sexuality in these non-traditional spaces oftentimes replicate some of the same damaging messages that they've heard in the traditional spaces. So these parachurch institutions like Pinky Promise or Wives in Waiting, while I do find great benefits in them, particularly around the accountability piece, I do think that they replicate the same sense that virginity and purity, sexual purity, is all a woman has to offer. That's what her gift is to God, and that's what her gift is to her potential spouse. And I think that's a really damaging way to think about one's body. And on one hand, you're hearing that God created this body and divinely created it and orchestrated it in such a way to be a gift. And at the same point, like, it's a gift that has all of these problems. It's the gift that you can't take back with the receipt. Like, it doesn't logically hold that the non-traditional spaces are going to be able to provide a more nurturing and a better environment for women, because they are still holding on. I largely to this conservative Bible reading that they're taking as significant, this biblical truth, one version of a biblical truth. Whenever I speak in churches, and I also get invited to speak to churches, I never get invited back, but folks have me often for the first go round. And then I get up there and I talk about masturbation, or I talk about sexual pleasure. And then they're like, oh gosh, we had no idea. But I say, if we're going to talk about the Bible, let's talk about these things. The Song of Songs is a text that's all about oral sex. Nowhere in the text does it say that they're married. It just seems like they're a couple that's hot for each other. that's some good stuff we could teach about. This a biblical text about sexuality. Or I say, you know, you want to advocate biblical marriage and you want to advocate biblical marriage, okay, but why are you only reading it in this one way, as one man and one woman? The Bible talks about multiple marriages. Polygamy is a biblical marriage. Marriage between siblings is a biblical marriage. Incest is a biblical marriage. So what are we highlighting? And there are many damaging versions. And I think the highlighting of heterosexual marriage as the only way is also another damaging version. So when I want to talk to folks about, in non-traditional spaces, about what they're doing, I also want to highlight that fact that you can't be doing something new on the old foundation, that the old foundation has problems, and that's why you needed to do something new. So I see this also in gay churches. I attended a Pentecostal gay church in Atlanta, and I went, it's led by a gay man pastor. He has a husband, and I went, and there were no women in leadership at all. Like, all of the leadership structure was men. And they gave me a lap cloth when I came, because I typically, when I attend a church for the first time, I wear a dress, because not all churches allow pants. And they gave me a lap cloth, and I was so morally offended. I was like, really? We're going to be a whole ass gay church full of queer people that is Pentecostal, but the things you're going to keep are the doilies on your head and the lap cloths for the women? That's what we're going to bring by? So that there are ways in which I think we're doing new things, but we're keeping some of the damaging things that uphold patriarchy or uphold sexism or uphold racism that I think need to be broken loose.
Thank you. I'm going to ask a follow-up question to that. What are the connections between the purity movements that you studied in your book and the ones that we would associate with white evangelicalism that I would associate as being targeted more towards teenagers and young adults? So I'm thinking of stuff like True Love Waits. I'm thinking of Joshua Harris back in the day. Like, what's the connection? Because I see you're talking about sort of making space for singles, and that seems very sociologically adapted to the reality that many people in communities of color never get married because of socioeconomic reasons. So you're more likely to have older single people. Whereas the assumption in white churches is people are going to get married, they'll be married by the time that they're 30. So you just are trying to get them to hold on and not have sex until like they get to that point, because it's probably going to happen pretty quickly.
Yeah. I think that's the answer. I would also say that what I've noticed in Black celibacy movements is that another striking difference is white evangelical purity movements assume white girls are pure. That is a taken for granted a priori assumption that virginity and purity are a given, that Black girls are never given that level of assumption. So Black girls are presumed at 6 and 7 with their hands on their hips, double dutching, to be sexual beings, to be hypersexualized in ways that white girls never are. And so that dynamic also is at play, that they start at different starting points because of the sexual stereotyping that happens for Black women. I think it also, Black purity movements are working double time to undo those sexual stereotypes. So I am claiming my celibacy, and I'm making such a big public deal about it because I want you to know Black women aren't this thing that you assume that we all are. I also think that, to your point, that Black women, we do marry. We marry much later than the white and Hispanic and Asian population. And so when we marry at 45 and at 52, we're participating in these movements for a lot longer. That the white True Love's Waits and the ring thing and the white evangelical movements, they really don't see themselves beyond like college age, because that's when they're supposed to get married. Whereas that's kind of how the senior chapter in the book showed up, because I was so confused when I got to the Pinky Promise Conference, national conference, and there were these older women there, women over the age of 50. And I thought originally that they were chaperones. And then when we'd have breakout groups and they would share like, oh no, y'all paid y'all money for real. Like, y'all believe this too. Oh. And it was baffling to me, because how do you still believe this at 50, that God is still sending you a husband? How do you still believe that you're called to sexual chastity and to not express yourself sexually for 6 decades? Like, I just don't understand. But I think that is a major difference, is that they have to be celibacy and fidelity ministries, because we're talking about a longer gap of period of time. And so their demographic is still college age. The Pinky Promise has most of its chapters on college campuses, but they have to go beyond that, because many more Black women are still unmarried at 30 and at 40. And so if the message is good at 20, it's still got to be true at 30, and it's still got to be true at 40, even though life experiences says that ain't really the case.
Right. But I mean, is this notion of celibacy kind of a broadening of thinking about, it doesn't matter what you've done before, right? But there is this now. So in some ways it goes beyond sort of the white sort of evangelical, like, you know, you squeeze the Snicker bar, like sort of around the room, or spit in the cup to sort of like demonstrate sort of like it's the end of the world if you lose your virginity before marriage type of situation. They're still doing a lot of the same things, but
yeah,
they may be starting from a different starting place because of an assumption of prior experience.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, so the next question is, I hope I say this name correctly, Ipsita Chatterjee. They ask, good afternoon. Thank you for talking about the book and the current project. This is a self-interested question given my research interests. Are there any of the statements about standing in or being an authentic self, about creating the kingdom of God, so to draw from Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, despite men and obeying God and not men or patriarchal norms? Or are they coming to the space of finding their authenticity because if they're going to hell, best make it a socially just place? So what was the range of the phrasing on this among your interviewees?
Thank you so much. And Ipsita is a good girlfriend of mine. So yay, hi Ipsita. This is a great question. And it's one that I'll have to continue thinking about, because I think for some are thinking about bringing justice here on earth. So I remember one of my interviews with Bishop Yvette Flunder. She did talk about the Lord's Prayer. No, this was Carrie Jackson. When I interviewed Dr. Carrie Jackson, she said, you know, the Lord's Prayer is about give us our daily bread, that it's meant for all of us, that our Christian path is meant for us to understand ourselves as interconnected, and that if I have and you don't have, that's a problem. So if I have justice, but you don't have justice, then I've got to keep working until you have justice as well. And so there is this overwhelming sense of holistic justice, I think, that goes beyond just advocating for the LGBT community, that they're wanting to create a world. One of my interviews, Bishop Tanya Rawls, who was one of the bishops in the Unity Church that's now UCC, she talked about her church deciding that justice and authenticity looked like what it looks like for the most marginalized community members, and that they recognized in their community that was transgender persons, and that until that they had an experience that the transgender sex worker could feel comfortable being fully themselves in, that they couldn't say that they had achieved anything. And so, yes, that was about creating this space here on earth for them and for us, that when that happens for them, then it happens for the rest of us. It goes back to the Kambihi collective statement that when the world is just for Black women, then it'll be just for everyone else. That when we get it right for these marginalized community members, we'll have done that work. But I think that there's also a personal dynamic that, yes, for some of them, it wasn't everybody's story that they were seeking authenticity for others. That for some, they had spent so much of their lives inauthentic, and it had cost them so much that they were now doing this path for themselves, that was their goal. And so the chapter in the book addresses that. So it's sort of like a part A and part B, those who are doing this for themselves and those who are doing this for others.
Great, thank you. Okay, so this question is from one of our fellows, Layli Harrell. She says, thanks for such a fascinating talk. And general discourses, especially in the United States, gender and sexuality are regularly collapsed. For example, to be trans is also to be quote unquote sexually deviant. Are most of these women-loving women in these spaces cisgendered? Is there any presence of the trans or non-binary community in these churches run by lesbian women? Or is gender less of an issue than sexuality?
Yeah, so we were talking in a chat before. So one of my reviewer comments was like, hey, you copping out on why your book is about cisgender women. And I say it's because of sample reflection. So I did snowball sampling. So I interviewed someone, and by word of mouth, I said after the interview, like, who would you think I should go talk to? And they would send me to someone, and I'd call them up and say, I just interviewed so-and-so, and they suggested you, and then they would, do it. And so that ended up with a sample pool that was completely cisgender. And that's what I said in the book proposal, and that's what I said in the chapter that I sent out to be reviewed. And they said that's a cop-out. Like, you have to own up to the fact that there was something about your sample, the way you designed your sample, that you drew cisgender persons. And I think that's true. And it's not even, I know that that's true. And so I think we often have to continually check our own heterosexist bias, that I think that was working within my design pool that I wasn't aware until it was done. And then it wasn't until it was pointed out that I was like, oh crap, that is true. Because when I think about the churches that I attended, there were transgender women there that were in leadership. And when I would do the interview, because most of them, I went to them to do their interview. And if they were leading a religious service, I attended that religious service. And so I actually did have at my disposal other women I could have interviewed. I could have said, hey, your associate or the person who's on the, organ, do you think you could set up a time for me to talk with them? And I didn't do that. So that's on me. That's the limitation of my study, that it is on 18 cisgender women, and it doesn't look more plurally than that. But no, most of these spaces are not cisgendered. They're, I don't want to say it's half and half, but depending on the community, like when I was out in California, Bishop Flunder's church does have a large transgender population. They were a church that was in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco, and now they've moved out to Oakland. And I've seen a shift since they've moved, I think numerically, in the number of trans persons that go there. But I think certain geographic demographics allow for more trans presence than others. The Charlotte church, Bishop Rawls' church that I was talking about, where she pointed out that they needed to have more attention to their trans experience. Charlotte has a larger trans population, and so their church also. But that wasn't the case. For example, Carrie Jackson is in, I think she's in Arizona. So she doesn't have a huge trans population that she's interacting with. I think geography deals with some of that. But I do know that there is still gender issues present. I was talking with one leader, and they talked about making the church have unisex bathrooms, and how that was still a problem, and how surprising that was to her that was a problem, given the fact that they were an LGBT church, that, clearly this shouldn't be an issue, but it was an issue. So there's still transphobia even in same gender loving communities. It doesn't go away just because they're all lumped together in one acronym.
So I have a follow-up question from Dr. Chatterjee. And so I think the question is, so social holiness vibe in an expansive way.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So unless there are any other questions, I think the final question is going to be from Dr. Combs. She says she was struck by how many of the respondents seem to be talking to multiple audiences. For example, Reverend Naomi talked about wanting to teach her daughter to love unapologetically and to let your yes be yes and your no be no. Reverend Deborah talked about second-class citizenship and not living in hell. I wonder if you got the sense that they were speaking to other audiences, maybe trying to get them to join the fight or see and speak out against perceived hypocrisy.
Oh, that's a great question. So I realized when I got to the end of the book manuscript that I started looking for their stories, like, because many of them are public figures, and so they publicly speak places, and there'd be a YouTube video or a collected story somewhere. And I began to see similarities. And I mean, to a degree, your story is your story. It should be the same. You know, if I'm telling a story about my childhood, it shouldn't vary that much. But I began to see that there was a crafted way, an effective way of telling their stories. So queer storytelling becomes a marketable skill. And I think it is so that they can be persuasive to more audiences. So I think about the number of times that I've heard Bishop Flunder. Bishop Flunder tells a story about growing up Pentecostal. She was a phenom, a teen phenom in the Church of God in Christ. She even went to the Church of God in Christ High School. They have a boarding school in Mississippi, of all places, which is where Juanita Bynum went. It's sort of where they sent all their prodigies. And she talked about, you know, all the things you have to do to be within the Church of God system. You have to, you know, stay in a certain place. And I say you're preaching, just, you know, thank you for giving this humble woman an opportunity. And so she often talks about her disconnect between her mother and her mother's inability for a great number of years to accept the fact that her daughter was a lesbian. She has a daughter and a son that were queer. And eventually, over time, she wins her mother over. They start shopping, she recognizes that there are other things that they can do together that don't have to do with church. And so shopping is one of the things. And so she tells this story about like shopping week after week with her mother and how they would get to a topic that kind of addressed queer stuff or something that her mother's faith background wouldn't allow her to talk about in a more diverse way. And so they would shut down a conversation. And she talks about how her mother gets to this point where she says, hush now, you're starting to make sense. And if you're making sense, then I could have done something different with my whole life. And that there's a way in which her telling that story, and eventually her mother comes over. She comes over from the Kojic Church and is a minister with her in her community at City of Refuge. And there's a way in which telling those stories on that one-on-one level is so effective beyond just this is my life story, let me tell you what happened to me. It's about telling the story in a way that advocates for others to tell their stories and for others to try what I've tried, and sets a background, a way for people to make space for themselves that I really do think does the work of really speaking to the larger issues at hand. And so for me, that's the promise of the interviews, is that it's not just one story. It is the power of one story, but it's beyond that in some significant ways.
Okay, then. Well, seeing no further questions, I know we can't see everybody, but please join me in thanking Dr. Moultrie for such an engaging talk. We really, really appreciate it. And just a brief announcement for next week. Just remember, our talk next week is going to be Dr. Alejandro de la Fuente from Harvard, and he's going to be talking about race, freedom, and law in Cuba, Virginia, and Louisiana. So thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you next week.